Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week we're going to pose a very simple question, which I think is relevant in this particular course since we're looking at the history of something. And that is to pose the question, who were the Athenians? Who were they? Why are they still important? What did they accomplish? What did they fail at trying to accomplish? And what is their abiding influence in the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th, and the 21st century? So that's what we're going to look at today. Kind of set the stage to better understand why starting a history of philosophy here, rather than 1,000 years later, is actually valuable. What is it about the ancient Athenians that we should think about? So we're going to break it down in terms of these 5 blocks here. We're going to start with early Athenian thought. Then we're going to move over to the importance of the Greek alphabet, and then Greek Paideia, which is basically translated into lifelong learning. And then we're going to move into the more contemporary times, 18th century France and 18th century Germany, and the influence of Greek thought. And finally, we can conclude with some ideas from the 20th century to at least allow us to better understand why, starting in a history of philosophy, we begin with the Greeks. So we can ask ourselves, what do the ancient Athenians have to offer us today? What can we go back and look at and say, yes, this is worth looking at? Perhaps the most important aspect of ancient Athenian thought is that it does represent the starting point for Western civilization. Now, I mentioned last week that there are other philosophies around the world, African, Islamic, Eastern, Indian, indigenous, all kinds of different types of philosophies. In this particular case, we are looking primarily at Western philosophy. So we need to keep in mind the influence that Greek philosophy had on Western Europe. So we can certainly argue fairly conclusively that the starting point for Western civilization really truly begins in ancient Athens. So it is a starting point, and it shapes not only the West and Western thinking or Occidental thinking, but most of the democratic worlds that we see today. Now, we'll get into details as to why it's not truly a democratic world in ancient Athens, because democracy here is just an idea. It's not substantial. It's not evoked in the same way that we would consider democracy after the French Revolution and the American Revolution. But still, the first most important aspect of the study of Athenian thought is to remember that it is the starting point of Western civilization. Now, along with the beginnings of civilization, we also have Western political and legal institutions that can also be traced back to ancient Athens, in particular of the 5th and the 4th century. Now, remember, prior to the birth of Christ, time is essentially moving backwards, which gives you an idea of just how flexible the concept of time is. At one point, it moved backwards. Then all of a sudden, for no particular reason, actually it was the birth of Christ, it starts moving forward. I digress. Point is, Western political and legal institutions can be traced back to ancient Athens as far back as the 5th and the 4th century. So we're talking well beyond 2,500 years ago. So the ideals of democracy, the ideals of law, the institutions of those two as well, have their start in the political philosophies of Plato and of Aristotle, respectively. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, but the notion of democracy being quite different in Athens than it is in the modern world. Now, the main reason for this is because during the time of the ancient Athenians and its civilization, of course, condensed down into the city-state, or what was known as the polis, democracy was really for certain individuals. It was exclusively for men with landed property in particular. So you could be a man living in ancient Athens, but you could also be a slave. You could be a foreigner. You could be a transient worker. You could be a child, a male child. Each one of those individuals did not have a say in the day-to-day affairs of Athens, but landed individuals who owned the landed property or businesses, they were the ones who were able to basically discuss the laws of the day, repeal certain laws, bring in others, and really that's That's where we can say that democracy is in its infancy at this point. It's not the same thing. It is not the rights of every individual living in a particular community. It's actually only the rights of certain individuals that happen to be male and are landowners. So along with the cradle of civilization, legal and political institutions, we also have the notion that the scientific and philosophical knowledge that we have today, and the technical achievements as well, are made possible as a result of pre-Socratic thinkers, as well as Athenian thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle. So the amount of scientific development of this time is remarkable. And this is kind of another reason why Athenian thought and activities in ancient Greece are still so important to us now, because we know that science and philosophy essentially begin in that city-state, in Athens. In fact, not in other city-states in what was much later Greece. Sparta, Crete, Thebes, all these places did not have the same philosophies that we find in Athens. In fact, none at all. So this is another absolutely remarkable facet about this ancient world, that all these individuals somehow all seem to live in the same place, in Athens. So pre-Socratic thinkers who end up in Athens, Athenians themselves, create this body of scientific and philosophical knowledge and technical knowledge as well that has been passed down to us to the present day. Now, clearly, certain things are no longer valid. No, the earth does not float on a body of water, or the earth is stationary and the sun revolves around it. Yes, obviously, we've clarified some things, but it's beginnings. The beginnings of these types of knowledges, right, philosophical, scientific, technical, have their beginning in ancient Greece. And then finally, the fourth one is that the early Athenians, and this is a very important one that especially today, and I don't mean today in a general sense, I mean today in 2022, the ancient Athenians showed us, in fact, almost by way of warning, that future Western civilizations needed to understand the relationship, the abiding and important relationship between political freedom, technological advancements, and the exercise of reason. All those things were essential to the creation of knowledge. Human freedom had to exist in order for people to think. Imagine a situation where thinking a certain thought could get you killed. And the Athenians knew and warned us for the future civilizations that those aspects needed to be there and needed to be protected and cherished. Political freedom, technological advancements, and the exercise of reason. And all of this was within the confines, and I don't mean the confines in a restrictive sense, but within the context, perhaps, the context of human freedom. So human freedom and rational thought went hand in hand. The moment one is compromised, the other is compromised as well. So those are the reasons why we still go back to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Athenians in particular, to see how they brought about some of these innovations, scientific, philosophical, technical. And the way in which they did it was through this notion of human freedom and its relationship to rational thought. Now, again, the notion of freedom is a contingent one, because I just finished mentioning that Athens was still a slave state. Other city-states were also slave states. But when we have philosophers talking about liberty and freedom and happiness, it's of a very particular kind. So human freedom is the freedom to think. It may not be the freedom to move around and work where they want, because clearly slaves did not have the kinds of human freedoms that are being discussed here. So human freedom is very tightly connected with the idea of rationality, reason, and philosophical inquiry. Without that, it's not possible. Okay, so reason and objectivity are essential to the achievement of just about any goal that is imaginable. So prior to the ancient Athenians, reason was used not in the same way that we think about it now in a philosophical sense, but where the substantial change begins to occur, one that affects us, is prior to the ancient Athenians, reason was tied very directly with notions of religion and mythological thought. So what makes this time so remarkable is reason, through its own volition, breaks from religion and breaks from mythological thought in order to create a realm in which thought could be discussed in its pure sense, pure thoughts, pure ideas, unhinged to reality. Now, that's for better or worse, of course, but what we are able to see here, and for the very first time, is reason existing but not tied to religion or mythology. That is a very important aspect. Now, how does all of this come together? How is it that reason can finally make a break from religion and mythology and mythological thinking? In particular, mythological thinking at this early time is used to explain the world. The gods and goddesses that inhabit mythological stories are perhaps a little bit less important than the stories that they convey to the listener, because at this point they're only listening. And as you can see, I'm building up to what I'm about to talk about. Mythology was a way for individuals to understand the world. A particular state of affairs, a weather condition, some climatic event, cataclysm of some sort, was often associated with the mythological story that the gods were vengeful, or we did something that we need to now appease the gods because the end result was a tidal wave or an earthquake or something worse. What happens over a period of time of roughly about 150 years from the beginning of the Greek alphabet to the writings of Plato and Aristotle is this remarkable achievement, this remarkable tool, which is the Greek alphabet. So, why is this important? Well, because it's revolutionary, right? It's a piece of revolutionary technology in the sense that it has a deep impact on human culture, and really more than any other invention, Archimedes' screw or sundials or anything else, writing was absolutely crucial in allowing philosophy to assert itself. And it does it by having this device, this tool called the alphabet. And this took a long time. And of course, this is the result of the Dark Ages, which would be around 1200 BC. It truly was the Dark Ages. In fact, the Greek alphabet was one of the many things that basically died away. It was dark in every sense of the word. Now, people could speak to one another, and they could remember the stories. The oral tradition of mythology was really the only thing that people had to remember the past. And of course, mythological stories were considered to be a kind of history, but no one could write it down. So to be able to remember these stories was absolutely paramount. So along comes new ways of viewing the world, new ways of thinking, and at the same time, perhaps one beget the other, we're not sure, but along comes this fantastic new technology called the alphabet. So what happens is this 3,000-year-old problem of how to remember things is now solved. Individuals can now, and this is sort of a variation of the Hebrew alphabet, but it became the Greek alphabet. What mattered was that individuals could now write down words to convey an idea. And not only that, but in the ability to convey an idea into words and write it down a papyrus or stone or whatever, that individual no longer had to worry about a rhyming couplet or asserting some mythological story that is going to convey the truth. Individuals that are now became literate and could write were able to sit down and think of the best way to describe a particular idea. Now, right now, my laptop is held up by my ancient Greek dictionary. I'm looking at it right now. Trust me when I say it's almost 4 inches thick, which means that when the Greek alphabet was devised, the first thing individuals did was try to pin down words and phrases and meanings so that others could look at this work and understand exactly what was being said. And all of these ideas, and I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but it comes out of this book by Eric Havelock, The Literate Revolution in Greece and Its Cultural Consequences. So Havelock investigates the conditions surrounding the change in the means of communication between human beings and how it impacts them socially and personally, and especially intellectually. And this change, right, this new tool, the Greek alphabet, introduces a new kind of mind, what Havelock calls the alphabetic mind. So rather than a mind that is absolutely steeped in memory and an oral tradition, right, the ear, instead, if it becomes a tradition based on the alphabetic mind and the eye, seeing words on a papyrus, seeing words etched out on something, or even on the ground, it doesn't matter. The point is, this Greek alphabet is this brand new means of communication that is no longer oral, that is no longer having to worry about rhyming couplets and making sure that the story sort of fits within the confines of someone's memory banks. That alphabetic mind is the beginning. It's that foundation of the philosophical mind. Because now individuals can use the Greek alphabet to sit down and think about the world, think about what they're seeing. And rather than having to worry about a story that goes along with it, they now think of an appropriate phrase, an appropriate word, in order for them to mean, in the best way possible, the idea that they are formulating in their minds. So, as I mentioned, why was this invention so important? For all the reasons that I've just mentioned here. The written alphabet converted a spoken tongue, right, part of an oral culture, into this objective artifact. Just like this book by Mr. Havelock, who is no longer with us. I open up the pages, there is the text, and I can hear his voice as I read through this work. So the written alphabet converted a spoken tongue, an oral tongue, into an objective artifact. And it separates the speaker from the word, separates the speaker from the language. And this visible artifact, the alphabet that I can see rather than someone speaking and I listen to them, this visible artifact can be preserved without having to rely exclusively on memory or the existence of the speaker. That speaker can disappear and pass away, but their ideas live on. And there is my big fat Plato book right here. Whoops, wrong way. There's my Plato book. Plato's long gone, but there are his ideas right here for me to read out loud if I like, but there they are. So this visible artifact that magically, almost beyond comprehension, occurs at the same time. And again, I don't want to argue the chicken or the egg argument that the Greek alphabet came first and then philosophy. I would argue that probably the ideas were there at first, and the alphabet almost became something by necessity, right, that needed to be recreated. The Greeks had an alphabet, but after 1200 BC, during the Dark Ages, when everything was destroyed, including language and the alphabet, it was then around 750 BC sort of rediscovered. Clearly, for us and for philosophy, this artifact could be preserved without having to rely on memory, rhyming couplets, mythological stories. They could be rearranged and rethought to create statements. And not only that, but those statements can be read by other people and reflected upon. And then a new idea is written as a result of it. So speech and the written word are now two different vehicles by which ideas can be communicated. But communication, right, does not take place until speech is heard or writing is read. So as a result, there has to be a speaker, writer, and a listener, reader present. So that should actually be the other way around. It should be a speaker, listener, and a writer, reader. I apologize. So what is happening here is the conditions of literacy become much, much more important. It's one thing to sit and listen to stories as a young child and grow up knowing all these mythological stories of Artemis and Diana and Hera and Zeus and all the rest of them. But all of a sudden, the desire, the need for literacy becomes really important. So the conditions of literacy depend not on the history of writing, but on reading someone else's words. It's really that simple. So in this context, we have a new way of thinking about the world and our relationship in it, and a brand new tool by which we can write down these ideas that we come up with as we reflect on those relationships. So, what did that mean to philosophy? And I've hinted this already. The first is that it meant the conditions of literacy through thought dependent on the technology used in writing, whether papyrus, or whether it's stone, some tablet of one sort. The condition of literacy was not to be defined by the simple existence of this technology. It also had to be a social issue or a social situation, which is literacy. People needed to learn to read. So if you can read, hopefully you can think. So literacy and thought together become socially shared by both writing and reading publics. So whether Plato had a reading public or Aristotle or anyone else for that matter, that reading public was contingent upon not only the availability of the text written by these people, but the ability of the person that is in possession of the text to be able to read it. So the conditions of literacy become a kind of social phenomena. It becomes a social condition. The only way in which philosophy can be transmitted to others is through the literacy of individuals. Now, that's not to say that there were philosophers that exclusively wrote. Socrates never wrote anything down. He simply would show up somewhere and start a conversation with someone, which of course soon would devolve into an argument. But generally speaking, the conditions of literacy, right, which is dependent on the technology, had to be more than that. It wasn't just, okay, I've got a sheet of papyrus with my ideas on it. Great. I've written this down, but no one can read it. Fantastic. So literacy, right, was a social condition that was necessary for the promotion and promulgation, we'll say, of philosophy. And it was, of course, defined in terms of readership. There had to be people to read the philosophy of the day. That's essentially what I'm trying to say. The second one is, and this is perhaps the more important one, is that the written language now had the capacity to articulate abstract thoughts. So what does that mean? Rather than describing the what of the world, we can now begin to describe the why of the world. So why is this important? It's important because philosophy is really the history of delving into abstract thoughts. So having a written language allowed people to write about the why of things, not just the what or the how, but why things are the way they are. And not only that, abstract thoughts were really the beginnings of philosophy moving into that metaphysical field that we talked about last week, that natural inclination that we have to move beyond reality to try to figure out laws that govern the things that we see that are going on behind. So imagine trying to come up with a mythological story that is describing metaphysics. It's just not possible. But a written language now had the capacity to articulate abstract thoughts rather than describing what's directly in front of us. So the Greek alphabet, the discovery of it, allowed individuals to capture and describe and define abstract thoughts really for the first time. And so the notion of thinking about something starts at this time as well. So again, the Greek alphabet, I cannot stress enough how important it was that tool, that invention, occurs at exactly the same time as the beginnings of philosophical thought or abstract thoughts. The two are intimately integrated into one another, but without a written language, it would have become much more difficult to try to describe something that you can't see, right? It's as simple as that. So a written language allows us to articulate abstract thoughts, which is really the bread and butter of philosophy. That's really what it is. Okay, so were there some problems, or were there individuals that didn't think too highly of the written language? Well, surprise. There's Plato again. Now, look at how thick this book is. It's 1,800 something pages. It's a lot of writing, small lettering too. And I'm not being facetious. Plato was not a fan of the written language. And here's what he says in Phaedrus, lines 275a. So Socrates is speaking, and he says, "And in this instance, you who are the father of letters, from a paternal love of your own children, have been led to attribute to them a quality which they cannot have. For this discovery of yours, right, because it is brand new at this point, this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's soul, because they will not use their memory. They will trust the external written characters and not remember of themselves. So the specific which you have discovered is an aid not to memory, but to reminiscence. And you give your disciples not truth, but only a semblance of truth. They will be hearers of many things, and he will learn nothing. So Socrates, really it's Plato speaking through Socrates, thought that the invention or the introduction of the written language would allow our memories to eventually dissolve away, because we're just referring to these graphic little sort of things on a page, or a papyrus in this case. So if that's the case, language is now going to affect our abilities to remember all of the events that we now experience, maybe less so directly, but more in terms of being reminded as we read these little graphic signs on a page. So the ironic thing is Plato spends 1,800 pages telling us how bad the written language is, and yet writes many of his stories, or his parables, whatever you want to call them, in the form of dialogues. So this is the way in which Plato, Mr. Ingenious here, can have it both ways. On the one hand, he whines about how the written language is going to erode the capacity for memory and direct experience, right? Because all we're going to be looking at is, as he says, we're going to be reminded of things. These are just going to be aids for us to go back and think of something. It's only a semblance of truth. But Plato wasn't stupid either. He knew that the written language was here to stay. So he created his dialogues in such a way that they sounded like they were happening spontaneously, like a kind of reality show, like a reality show that stars Socrates, Phaedrus, and who knows who, right? There'll be someone else there. And they're having a conversation, and the ideas are bounced back and forth. And Socrates says something, and Phaedrus responds, and Socrates says something else. And Plato, really, by having it both ways, was able to write down the thought process that these individuals went through to achieve some kind of truth by consensus. And Socrates and the rest of the characters that inhabit Plato's dialogues do exactly that. So this is how Plato was able to use this brand new tool and still kind of get the better of us, or think that he could have it both ways, by writing his stories as dialogues. They sound like they're happening in real time by people who are speaking, but he's also writing them down. And he is the ultimate arbiter, right? The editor of the story. So clearly, whatever Plato wants to discuss, that will be the truth that comes out of the particular dialogue or parable that's being discussed. But certainly here in Phaedrus, the idea of language, the written language being a good thing, is somewhat problematic, because we're no longer going to use our memories. We're just going to be looking at things and be reminded. Everything will only have a semblance of truth. Plato is going on about something which is relevant to us, because many of us today know things from reading newspapers and books and speaking to other people. So is that a bad thing? Because certainly at the time that Plato was living, you could experience the totality of the world while living literally in one city, because the things that were worth knowing were literally at your fingertips. I know that the sun is hot. I know that people have walked on the moon. Have I been there? No. Do I need to go there? Probably not. But I've read about it in books and magazines and articles. So that's the difference. For Plato, direct experience is more important than secondhand information, right? That semblance of truth that he's talking about. So I just wanted to point that out, that not everyone was a fan of the written language, but Plato certainly used the written language to let us know 2,500 years later how he felt. So that is rather important. Now, another aspect of Greek life is Greek Paideia. And Paideia is Greek for lifelong learning. And this series of ideas come out of these books here. Paideia by Werner Jaeger, Volume 1, Archaic Greece, Volume 2, In Search of the Divine Center, and 3, The Conflict of Cultural Ideas in the Age of Plato. All three of these books, and again, close to 1,000 pages. What Jaeger is talking about here is this notion of paideia, which was a civilizing and educational shaping of the Greek mind. Education and ethics were absolutely paramount in the ancient city-state of Athens. And the way in which individuals would become good citizens, right, good thinkers, but primarily good citizens, was through the use of paideia. So education, self-improvement were very important concerns for the polis, because without good citizens, the polis could be threatened in some way, way, shape, or other. So we needed to have good citizens that could make informed decisions on whatever the matter was on that particular day. So Paideia was formed, and the intellectual process by which they constructed their ideals and their personalities were done in and through this lifelong learning, this lifelong civilizing and educational shaping. I think maybe in this day and age, the closest we have would be civics, to take a class in civics. That's maybe the closest we have to what the ancient Greeks found to be much more important, because they viewed life as a kind of totality. Everything was all connected together. So your ability to be a good citizen meant that the political institutions that were there were much better. The laws were better because people could think about them and be rational about them. But Paideia is still historically unique to Athens, because it was a way in which everyone could act responsibly. With Paideia, right, with that educational shaping of that Greek character, you could no longer turn around and blame the gods for screwing up. So everyone was able to act responsibly because they knew the difference between right and wrong. How did they know this? By being aware of Paideia, being aware of that civilizing and educational shaping that was available to them. So classical Athenian culture was the first to orient itself towards ideals, right? Not things in the here and now, but let's aim high. Let's aim towards ideals. And so Paideia, it becomes part of this critical self-reflection. And critical self-reflection is not only a kind of philosophical concept, so you can see how politics and philosophy are intimately intertwined, but with Paideia, there is also this part of critical self-reflection, right, within this very new political context called Athenian democracy. And without Paideia, there could be no democracy, or at least one that's going to function on any degree of rationality. So it was part of understanding the nature of political democracy and the idea of the polis. And Paideia was also the way in which individuals could begin to learn about culture, civilization, tradition, literature, but primarily education. All of these aspects are absolutely fundamental in not only creating a philosophical foundation to the Athenian city-state, but with it, that political and cultural context into which all of these other events are occurring. So Paideia, lifelong learning and education, was absolutely crucial to the Greek city-state. Okay, why was Paideia important in other aspects? Because if we engage with it, we have to remember that with Paideia, we no longer can blame others, right? We have only ourselves to blame. And so a good example of Paideia was this relationship between tragedy and a kind of ethical life. And what I mean here is the individual that is living in Athens through Paideia, through education, through that civilizing process, transforms from a singular entity to a social collective. So the notion of society, which again, in ancient Greece, there is no society. There is the family, which is also an economic unit, and then the state. And again, the family has been around even at this point for thousands of years, but the state is a very new thing. So the notion of everyone thinking together or thinking on behalf of the collective, the best way to do this is through that civilizing process that is part of Paideia. And Greek tragedy is also an important facet of this type of work, because what we have here is an exploration into Greek law, which is just beginning, right? It's in its infancy at this point. And surprisingly, and this is actually rather clever on behalf of the Athenians, is playwrights were often lawyers. So lawyers would use drama to explore the important legal issues of the day. And the end result is tragedy would be about someone who is not part of the social collective. Because when we talk about a tragic hero, right, it's not tragic heroes in the plural. A tragic hero is someone that cannot give up that individual psyche, cannot fit into the collective very well. So Greek tragedy was often about someone, an individual, pitted against society, pitted against the social collective. So those tragic dramas, right, were regarded as examples of collective political institutions that were operating at that time. So Greek tragedy is important in the sense that they became cautionary tales. It became a way to learn about the difference between the individual psyche and the dangers that lie therein, and the benefits of the social collective. I shouldn't go and do this because I might not only harm myself, but I might harm others through my actions. Well, that would be thinking in terms of the social collective. Someone else that turns around and says, well, I'm going to smote this character with my sword because he has insulted me. That's thinking individually, right? Not thinking about, well, perhaps if I do that, the repercussions could be a lot worse. So Greek tragedy tries to explore these new laws that are being brought into the city-state, and Greek tragedy and Greek drama work through some of these dilemmas. That what could someone do? And often the Greek tragedies were structured in such a way that the chorus would be reminding the viewer, right, the audience, of the right thing to do. So-and-so, Oedipus should be doing this and Zeus should be doing that. But this is the way in which individuals learned how the early democratic institutions were about to function. So ultimately, what they are tragedies as understood as self-limiting institutions. What I mean by that is they're cautionary tales, right? They expose the idea of being autonomous or individual. They also expose the dangers of hubris, pride, which is what that means. Virtuous actions are good actions. Actions on behalf of the collective are good. Therefore, they're not tragic. And really, this is what's happening. Athenian tragedy is part of this Greek Paideia, right? This is sort of the more spectacle-oriented one rather than sitting and talking about books. They are ultimately cautionary tales about taking matters into your own hands. That's kind of what they're about. But virtuous action, collective actions, social actions are better. So there is really no other way to convey the importance of social collectives within democracies being really the way to go. And so not only that, but even though you're part of that collective, you were still responsible for your own actions. You were warned. Remember that play where that idiot went out and did something really stupid? Don't be that idiot, right? So those tragedies were cautionary tales reminding people, think of the collective. Don't think as individuals anymore. That's quite dangerous. Okay, so that is Greek Paideia and the ancient Greek world. Now we're going to hop in our time machine and travel straight to the 18th century, and we're going to look at Greek thought in two different countries. We're going to look at 17th century France and the rediscovery of ancient Athens and the rediscovery of Paideia and the polis, right, the city-state, and ask ourselves, given the importance of these two aspects of ancient life, are these still viable political models today? Okay, that's kind of important because as it turns out that there were two countries that looked backwards and didn't quite get it right. And so let's take a look at the first one at France. And it really occurs during the French Revolution because with this very violent break from what had come before, which is an aristocracy, the church and the monarchy had basically ruled with an iron fist. And so there is finally an overcoming. There's a pure revolution that breaks with the monarchy, which really, if you can compare it, it would be the same break as ancient Athens had gone through, and the break with mythological thinking. So there is, on the one hand, this very strong sense of a brand new beginning. Something brand new is about to occur. But at the same time, there is also an awareness that there's a move back to something that existed in a simpler time, in an easier time, called democracy. And the question is, when you're about to begin and you've kind of hit the reset button brings you back to zero, right? What is zero? The beginning of Western civilization. Where does that take you? To ancient Athens. So there is, during the French Revolution or immediately after, two things that are going on. There's that strong sense of a new beginning, because this is something radically new. But in finding that this is a radically new world that they are about to live in the early 19th century, the first impulse is to look to the past for examples. And by doing that, the simple tradition of democracy becomes something that is considered very seriously. Okay, individuals such as Robespierre, a very key figure in the French Revolution, he and many others were great admirers of pretty well all things Greek. And he writes at one point, what is the fundamental principle of democratic or popular government? That is the essential mainspring that supports and drives it forward. It is Aristotelian virtue. And I mean that public virtue which performs such miracles in Greece and in Rome. So Aristotelian virtue was equated with integrity, justice, equality, nationalism, such as love for one's country, and individuals such as Robespierre looking back to the ancient world and looking for basically examples, found one of them in Aristotle's notions of virtue. So there is the very abiding influence of Greek thought on 18th century France. Now, another character, Montesquieu, had also believed that the notion of virtue and the virtue from ancient republics were very, very honorable and worth discussing and describing and defining and maybe bringing back, because by comparison, despotism, rampant monarchy, what they had up to this point was really truly awful. So the virtue that was found in ancient republics, in other words, a country, and remember, Athens is not a country, it's merely a city-state, but is still a republic. In other words, it's a government based on laws. And a government based on laws is a republic such as there is in the US, such as there is in France. And that was considered virtuous. So again, Aristotle's virtues became very important in Montesquieu's work, because this integrity of justice, equality, frugality, love for one's country could be sort of encapsulated and wrapped up in this notion of Aristotelian virtue. And so again, same sort of ideas. There is a look backwards as there is a brand new beginning on the horizon. The first instinct is to look backwards to an example. Where are we going to go? What did we do before? Well, Aristotelian virtues was one of the ways in which the French were able to make sense of that next step moving forward. Okay, so why didn't French intellectuals think this way? Because at this point, during the 17th century in France, a classical education was actually an education in Latin rather than in Greek, I should say. So classical authors such as the ones we talk about, Plato and Aristotle, are really not studied and taught in any significant way, but there was still this preoccupation with Greek and Roman history, because it was this kind of historical treasure house, this storehouse of moral precepts, of exemplary attitudes, exalted characters, high-minded ideals. All of these ideas, although not taught in the educational system, but because people were educated and could read Latin, some could read Greek, they were able to go back to these ancient sources. And even though not part of the educational system per se, were still accessible for individuals who had those linguistic skills. And of course, looking back, all these different ideas of morality and ethics and exemplary attitudes, all of these began to become very compelling to those individuals living, like the French intellectuals that are living after the French Revolution. Okay, so what they were buying into, what has been called since the myth of antiquity. Now notice the key word here, the myth of antiquity. Not the actual, not the sort of historical truth, but the myth of antiquity. So what is that? What is this myth that is sort of part and parcel of Greek thought? What was it that became so compelling to the 18th century French intellectuals? Okay, what had happened was that Roman writers of the ancient world had invented this myth about themselves and about others. And it consisted of this idea that in the early days of both the Roman Republic and the Greek republics, every individual there was brave, upright, filled with domestic virtues, and a zeal for the common good, socially conscious. We had dealt with all these problems, and the end result was that we were all these wonderful individuals. But it was essentially looking at history through rose-tinted glasses. So the myth of antiquity was this historical sort of treasure house of ideas written by Roman and Greek writers about themselves. Of course they're going to cast themselves in the positive light and say that they were brave and upright and virtuous. Of course they are. They're the ones writing the books. History is never written by losers, right? It's always written by winners. So the myth of antiquity is this sort of rose-tinted view of individuals writing about themselves. So bravery, uprightness, and virtue and so on may or may not have been there to the degree that it is described. And as a result, the French and later the Germans, those intellectuals fell under the sway, under the influence of this myth of antiquity. So in 18th century France, right, the myth of antiquity was uncritically, right, unreservedly, but uncritically raised to this level of an ideal that was the highest aspiration that any individual could follow through with. So this was the best of the best, without realizing that there was a little bit of fudging there, a little fudging of the truth, because remember, Athens was a slave state. Rome was a slave state. And here they are writing about virtuous behavior and freedom and liberty and happiness. Yeah, well, we now with hindsight can realize and see through that myth. But at that time, this was something very compelling. Now, I couldn't imagine what it'd be like to completely and utterly destroy every institution you've ever known and then look, past the horizon of just rubble and go, okay, what's next? There, you can understand there would have been a tendency for them to go back and look to the past for things that had worked. So that myth of antiquity was very appealing, right? Almost compelling. And so as a result, it was looked at uncritically and it was raised to the level of this ideal. And of course, is it an ideal? Yes, it is. But the problem is this, right? The power of mythical thinking is that myths embody perennial human aspirations, which are, of course, perennially frustrated. That's why they continue to exist. They're not meant to be achieved. They're meant to be aimed at. But mythology here and mythic thinking and virtuous and thinking, bravery and so on are aspirations. They're kind of fudging the story and trying to present us in the best light possible. But not every single person is like this. But more important is the power of mythical thinking, right? The forgetting in ancient 18th century France, the forgetting that myths are not meant to be realized, they're meant to be aimed at, but you will be always frustrated. So that contradiction becomes very difficult to overcome. Now, the French still come up with something very reasonable, but certainly the way they were looking at in the ancient Greek world was through these rose-tinted glasses and through this myth of antiquity that was perhaps not as truthful as it should have been. Now, the last part of this video lecture, we're just going to look briefly at 19th century Germany. So this would be the 1800s. And this very excellent book, The Tyranny of Greece Over Germany, written by Eliza Butler and back in 1935, she also talks about how German intellectuals of the 19th century kind of went through the same thing. They fell under the sway of this myth of antiquity. And German intellectuals, philosophers in particular, and we'll talk about some of these in this course, had this absolutely enamored relationship with what was called the Das Absolut, right? The absolute. And so the absolute pinnacle, the end point of anything, was something that absolutely fascinated the Germans. And the Germans were unique in the passion with which they pursued these ideas and attempted to transform them into reality for better or worse. And so we have on the one hand this enamored relationship that the French had with the ancient Greek world, however untrue it may have been, because it was looked at through rose-tinted glasses, but the end result was still something that was reasonable, right? Because the Declaration of the Rights of Man was one of the texts, the fundamental text that grew out of that French Revolution, and that was the securing of rights of all individuals. Where it goes completely off the rails is in 19th century Germany, and we'll see in just a moment why. So there was a tendency, according to Butler, in German thought to always aim for this Das Absolut, right? This absolute end point, whatever name, whatever guise they could find it. And the Germans were quite willing to become very passionate about this mythological thing that they were aiming at. And so the historical failure, right, and the very dangerous political history that this has is what we're going to look at here. Because when we are looking at Das Absolut, we're no longer connected to the real world, right? We're now in the world of dangerous idealism. And this is what we're talking about here. So what is Das Absolut? It means this. So absolute can be an adjective or an adverb. It derives from absolutus, which means it is Latin for detached or complete. And more importantly, not dependent on, self-contained, perfect, complete. So here is this idea, which is detached from reality, complete and self-contained unto itself, if that isn't bad enough, and then perfect. And so we look at this notion of the absolute, and we can see how compelling it may be. This is mythological thought times 10. I mean, it's mythological thought on steroids. And this idea of the absolutum can go back all the way back to the 1440s in reference to God. But by the 18th century in Germany, it wasn't necessarily connected to a divine relationship. What it did connect to was this idea of an ultimate unconditioned reality. As if you were to take metaphysics and push it as far as possible and then try to recreate that perfect world that is in metaphysics and try to realize it in the here and now. So Das Absolut referred to that ultimate unconditioned reality. There's that key phrase. It's no longer, linked in some way to reality. It exists detached, complete, self-contained, and perfect. And wow, if mythology wasn't bad enough to aim at, this is something even better. So, and here is what is quite remarkable, because this book by Butler was written in 1935. Keep that date in mind. So she's writing just before World War II, and Butler said of German writers, poets, and intellectuals that they were at the mercy of ideas. Whatever the ideas were, they lost all critical faculties. Whatever they could do to make this come into being, they would do it. Now, at this time, ironically enough, in Germany, there is something quite similar to the Greek Paideia called Bildung. And Bildung means self-cultivation. So the notion that you could cultivate yourself and be the best version of yourself through education, through experience, through reading poetry and so on, Bildung was very similar to Paideia in the sense that you could stand on the shoulders of giants in order to get a better view of the world. And guess what? Through all this education and all this intellectual experience and growth and development, you're seeking absolute beauty because you think there's no limit, right? There's no limit. I want to go right to the very end. So I want to cultivate myself to the best version of myself. But at the same time, you're at the mercy of ideas. So ultimately, the individuals that are writing and the thinkers of the 19th century Germany set the stage for this notion of looking for absolute beauty. Not conditional beauty or beauty in the eye of the beholder, but absolute beauty, right? In the realm of absolute truths, which can be dangerous. And so, here's what ends up happening. According to Butler, she writes, quote, Germany was a supreme example of her triumphant spiritual tyranny. So the spiritual aspect, that aspect of the absolute, became an overriding concern. Nothing else mattered. Ideas exercised a dynamic power over its recipients, and its tyrannical power or ideology that Butler tries to grasp and understand, which is why the book is called, right, The Tyranny of Greece over Germany. And so this is something that is really useful in trying to understand how Germany would have ended up moving towards a fascist government, as it looked to its ideals of perfection, of beauty, whether you want to talk about Aryan beauty. But you can see here, when you fall under the sway of a powerful entity like the Absolute, which is pure, detached, complete, perfect, except all of these things, and you are on the road to intellectual development, it doesn't take long that you end up on that road towards trying to realize this Absolute, because you know it is the end point. So there's a kind of tyranny that is brought down upon these intellectuals through this manic desire to create not only ideals, but then realize them. And so, as she writes, the Germans create sensations because they ignore obstacles and appear unaware of danger where ideas or ideals are involved. She's writing this in 1935, right? This is a few years before the takeover of the Nazi Party in Germany, and is already saying they create sensations because they ignore obstacles. In other words, reason is gone, rationality is gone, critical thinking is gone, and there is just this behemoth, this cultural movement towards the Absolute, towards the realization of these goals, which should never be realized. We aim at them, and we need to be aware and realize that we will fall short. But if you don't see those obstacles, right, or are unaware of the danger, that's when those ideas become extremely dangerous. So, did anyone warn them? Absolutely. Even Nietzsche had said in The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, right, that old Greek mythologies could not be transported into modern soil. They're just not going to fit. They belong in that ancient world. So instead, Nietzsche came up with his own mythology of the Übermensch, right, the overman. And this Übermensch really became the driver for this final push towards realizing the Absolute. So the Übermensch for Nietzsche was that teleological endpoint, right? The endpoint being the realization of das Absolut, and itself was also a variation from ideas originally presented to us by Aristotle. A teleological endpoint is the endpoint of anything, whether it's a piece of wood or a human being. The endpoint is the best version that thing can be. The end result is that Nietzsche's myth of the Übermensch then became harnessed onto Nazism, and the end result is what we know today as the rise of the Nazi Party, the Aryan state, the 1,000-year reign, and all the rest of it. But remember, Butler is writing about this in 1935, before it's occurred, and she gets it right. So, to conclude, on the one hand, that myth of antiquity is serviceable and helpful to the French during the late 1700s and the early 1800s in creating the rights of individuals, which is good. But on the negative side, we end up in the 20th century in Germany, where the same myth almost destroys that entire country, and instead creates something like the Nazi Party that was all about purity. Remember the words, pure race, the Aryan race, all these notions about purity. That was the Absolute speaking. So that's why the Athenians are important. That's why we need to remember that they were influential beyond their own comprehension, because obviously Plato and Aristotle would not have known about the rise of fascism, but certainly the seeds were there, right? The seeds were there. It was a matter of us looking at them critically or uncritically. That was the big difference. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed this, and we'll be back again soon with another module. Take care then. Bye-bye.